Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Chuck Mason, and with me today is my co-host, Janelle Blue. Janelle is the president of our sponsoring society, the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, and with us is another board member, Jeff Welch. Jeff is the current treasurer of Mount Vernon Society. And today we're going to talk to Jeff about his genealogical journey. Every one of us starts genealogy for usually a different reason. So today we want to find out what got Jeff into genealogy, because I know his wife Terry's eyes glaze over when he tries to get her interested.
Well, I started out, let me back up. My mother was the family historian. She started doing genealogical research on our family in the 1980s. She didn't have a computer. She didn't know what the internet was because it didn't exist at the time, and even when it was created, she never got on the internet. And she started gathering information on her side of the family and my father's side of the family. She did it by calling relatives on the telephone, which was mounted on the wall in our kitchen with a very long cord. She wrote letters and sent them via the post office because there was no email at the time. She would visit local libraries and do research with any books that they had at the time. And she and Dad would get in the car and they would drive to Kansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and they would visit graveyards and take pictures of graves of our relatives. And then she would bring all the information that she gathered home, and she would, using her electric typewriter with a correcting ribbon on it, and she would type up as much of it as she possibly could. And then she would put it all in a big cardboard box that sat in the den of their home in Albuquerque, New Mexico. When my mother passed away in 2011, my dad was talking to me and he said, "Hey, there's a box of stuff, I think it's genealogy, in the den. I'm downsizing, moving stuff out. Do you want it?" I was still working at the time, so I said, "Yeah, next time I'm out visiting you in Albuquerque, I'll pick it up, bring it home, and I'll take it off your hands." And I was still working at that time, working 60 to 80 hour weeks as a defense contractor, so I really didn't have time to get into it. Then I retired a year later, and I started to go through what my mother collected. Now, another thing my mother did, which was really cool, she was the collector of family pictures dating back to the early 1800s. She was very detail oriented, and if she could, she wrote on the back of every picture who it was, when it was taken, and what relationship they were to me. As a matter of fact, one of those pictures was of a great-great-great-grandfather, and it was his wedding picture, and it was in a clock that I have now inherited, that was their wedding picture in the back of a clock that he owned in the around 1870 time frame. A clock that you wind up and it runs for 18 hours. And then 18 hours later, you got to wind it up again. I have not touched the winding mechanism on it because I'm afraid I'll break it. But the fact that I have that clock and I have that picture and I know who's in the picture, I thought was really cool.
Gosh, Jeff, you are so lucky. Do you know how many people would, do anything to have that kind of documentation? Especially with the pictures.
I have box after box after box of pictures. A lot of them I know came from my great-grandparents' house, but who's in them?
Yeah,
most of them
that's the problem.
Forget it.
And the fact
Nobody knows
that she wrote stuff down too, so that you didn't have to go back and go through it and say, what was this and what was the relevance?
Yeah, one of the neatest things that I really liked that she did was at some point in the time, I want to say about 1985, 1990, she sat down and she wrote down everything she could remember growing up in Kansas and Missouri. Now her father, my grandfather, was a railroad depot manager. So they moved about every 6 months from one town to another to another. They'd literally just put their household belongings on a train, move to a new town, find a new place to set it up, and then he would work there for 6 months to a year and then move again. She sat down and wrote out everything she could possibly remember growing up, and when she was done, she sent it to her older sister for review. Yeah. Her sister wrote all over it, added stuff that she knew before when my mother couldn't remember back when she was 1, 2, 3 years old, she added to it. I actually have that handwritten, edited copy of it. Plus, my mother typed the whole thing up again on her electric typewriter with correcting ribbon. And I have that. Then later on, my mother said, okay, I'm going to take those first 12 years and I'm going to add to them. And she literally carried that through until she got sick in around 2009 and had to go into a extended care facility. And that was in that box of documentation. And my dad wasn't into genealogy. He really didn't care that much about it. And she met him when she was 14, so she added to it. They were married when she was 18 after he got back from World War II. So she added to everything that she knew about him growing up. They grew up in the same town. And at some point along the line, I sent that to his older sister, my aunt, who was a school teacher, very articulate, into her late 80s, early 90s. She reviewed it. She added 3 more typewritten pages to my dad's history. So I have a history almost from birth of everything they did, where they lived, who they lived next to, what going to school was like. I learned a couple things about my dad that he never told me about, and he probably would deny that his older sister told me. But it was very, very cool information. And I started to think myself, maybe I ought to do that for myself. So I have, in the past couple of years, actually done that for myself. I have an older sister. I sent it to her. I couldn't remember anything before my about 2nd birthday, maybe 3rd birthday. I sent it to her. She's 5 years older than me. She added that information for that time frame, because we actually did a family move and then came right back to where we started at. So she added stuff that I couldn't even remember of what it was like living in Twin Falls, Idaho. And I have that. I periodically add to it when another significant event enters my life, like my 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th children. And I haven't done it for my wife. As you mentioned earlier, she isn't that much into genealogy. She's Irish. She's 93% Irish based on DNA. She knows when her relatives came over. She knows where they were. That's good enough for her.
You mentioned one thing about your grandfather and the railroad, and pointing things out to our viewers. Have you found his railroad records?
I have found his railroad retirement records, which list about 8 or 9 of his last years, where he worked, what his pay was. They weren't actually time cards, but they're very, very interesting records. He actually was injured working on the railroad. He was pushing a luggage cart, slipped and fell, broke his leg, and he ended up going in the hospital and developing gangrene, and they had to amputate his leg. I've got all that documentation associated with that. Now, he told me he got his shot off in the war by a cannonball. I didn't know any difference when I was a little kid. I told my mother that one day, and she looked at me and said, "What?" No, he was in an accident working on the railroad.
Fathers embellish those things. My father did that with my nephew with his gallbladder scar. He had my nephew believing that the Indian shot him with an arrow. But those railroad records, my great uncle was an employee on the Pennsylvania Railroad, and I found the records in the state archives in Harrisburg and gave me similar kinds of things. It also finally led me to when his first wife died, which I at the time could not find because records were closed to me because they weren't 50 years old, so I couldn't get a death certificate. So they might be helpful to some of our viewers. That's why I wanted to point those out.
They were very good. And so when I got the box home, and when I finally retired and I had time to start dedicating myself to it, started pulling the stuff out of the box. She had put a basic tree together, and I took all of her information and just started to lay it out piece by piece. And it's like a big jigsaw puzzle, with too many pieces and then some pieces missing. Okay, so you're never going to get it perfect. But I started laying it out, and what I decided early on to do for me was I would create a data sheet for each married couple that's in my direct line. My parents, 2 sets of grandparents, 4 sets of great-grandparents, and on and on and on. And so I started to pull all this data together, lay it out in that form, and I said, okay, now I guess I need to take out a subscription to Ancestry.com. So that was the first organization that I actually joined to gather data. Since then, I've joined so many others.
So are you methodically going through to make sure that you have the citations that back up all of those things in your data sheet?
I wouldn't necessarily call them citation. I call them more like proof documents, like a birth certificate,
right, yeah.
or a marriage certificate or a death certificate if they had them. Obviously, the pictures that my mother sent, and you can definitely see the familial resemblance of the people. And my grandfather was a great letter writer, so he would send letters that my mom kept. Mm-hmm. So I had letters telling about his life, his kids, and everything. And I put it all together. Some of my data sheets are 3 to 4 pages long. I've got some that are 50, 60 typewritten pages of information. You start at the beginning, start with you, then your parents, then your grandparents, then your great-grandparents. And one of the cool things I found out, interesting, the great-grandfather that I had met was not my great-grandfather. He had married my great-grandmother after she divorced her first husband, my biological great-grandfather. Come to find out, excuse me, his family was very interesting. He had a very interesting story. There was an illegitimate birth in my bloodline early on. There was an unexpected pregnancy later on. You can find these documents at different places. It's pretty cool.
How did you discover that? I mean, did you do DNA or?
I had gone into the census records for 1880 for my great-grandmother, found her and found her kids. Then I went, 1890 doesn't exist, then I went to the 1900. In the 1900 census, my great-grandmother and her brother, or my grandmother and her brother, had a different last name. And I couldn't figure out what's going on. I went in, looked, and then I sent an email off to the Kansas Historical Society in the little bitty town and said, can you look into this and see what you find? And they went over to the courthouse and they found her birth certificate, which lists her last name. Now, at that time, they didn't give her a name when she was born. It was baby, last name was Gilliland, illegitimate birth. Interesting.
The given name not being there is quite common, but the illegitimate birth is less common, at least in research I've done.
It was on there. My great-grandmother was pregnant at 15 by my biological great-grandfather, who, by the way, had originally married my great-grandmother's older sister.
Oops.
Who died mysteriously. Little towns back then, newspapers are awesome. If you get into newspapers.com. I went in there, started looking things up. There was a big investigation of why this first wife died. There was an inquest done by the town. The whole story was in the newspaper. She died, committed suicide supposedly. Shortly thereafter, my great-grandmother got pregnant by this individual, had the baby, my grandmother, and then 6 months later, they wed, finally. So now she has a legitimate father. 2 years later, they divorced. So now my great-grandmother married the individual who I thought was really my great-grandfather. It wasn't. I was able to track via the census records, via the birth and death certificates, all of that, and put it all together. When you do, it's like I said, a jigsaw puzzle. All of a sudden you have this picture. And you take all these pieces of information, put it together, and you have this really cool picture of your family.
Were you able to get the divorce file?
I have not yet. I found a notation of the divorce in the little Kansas newspaper.
Because the divorce files can, really go into quite a bit of detail. I've gotten a number of divorce files.
If you can get the
if
court,
you can, it depends on what the law is in the state, and it varies. For example, here in Virginia, a divorce that took place last week, as long as the clerk has filed all the records and all, any one of us could walk in and get anybody's divorce. They're not restricted. Other states restrict what you can get.
So this was this great-great-grandfather or great-grandfather?
Great,
2 times?
great-grandfather.
Okay. Was he mentioned in these documents that your mother left, or was this a different part of the family?
He was, it was my dad's side of the family,
Okay.
and it was not mentioned anywhere. You know, little town Kansas, late 1800s, early 1900s. I'm sure this was not a topic of
But
conversation.
those small newspapers in small towns get into quite a bit of detail. I mean,
do.
I had one where somebody was killed in an accident, and it was quite graphic, especially for the time of, them finding the body and the conditions and things, more than you would find most of the time today.
I had one where they actually had excerpts from the trial. It was, the whole page of the newspaper, and it was really very revealing.
Right. That, and then if you can get into the newspapers and find obituaries. Yeah. Back then they wrote a lot, and the brothers, the sisters, the mother, father.
Exactly.
I've got one on ancestors that came in from Germany, and it answered one of my questions. It said his first wife died in Germany before he and his children immigrated to the United States. And then he remarried. So that told me right then that the lady who I had in the census records was a second wife, not a first wife. Yeah. She was not my biological great-great-grandmother from Germany. The first wife in Germany was, who I don't know the name. It didn't say the name, but at least that told me there was a first wife kind of thing.
Did you ever find out what happened to the rogue grandfather?
He married a third time. I don't think he had any children by the third wife. He moved to, I believe it was Ohio, and he eventually died, I think, of some sort of cancer, and I actually was able to get a copy of his death certificate and a photograph. Again, from the newspapers. So now I know what he looked like. Now, his family, looking at the biological line, looking at his family went back. I can trace his family back about 6-7 generations. A lot of them were preachers. A lot of them were against slavery and preached against slavery. And they went back many generations through Kansas, Missouri, Ohio, Illinois. And I'm not sure I can take them all the way back to the 1600s, but...
Jeff, you told us earlier that you and your sister take an annual trip. Tell us about that.
Right. In fact, I'm getting ready to do what we call genealogy road trip number 1, 2, and 3. I'm getting ready to do 3 in 10 days from now. My sister lives in Denver, and she and I share all of this information back and forth. As a matter of fact, she's in the Daughters of the American Revolution. She's the treasurer for the Denver chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution there. And we get together for a week, and I lay out an itinerary of where we're going to visit, what we're going to look for, and who we're going to talk to if we possibly can. 2 years ago, we did genealogy road trip number 1. We went to the northern neck counties of Virginia, and we visited areas where my relatives lived in the 1600s and 1700s. Now, based on my research, in the 1600s, I had 4 pockets of relatives. I had a group up in New England, a group in New Amsterdam, now New York and Long Island, and a group in southern Maryland, and then a group in Virginia. So I had 4 pockets there. So genealogy road trip number 1 focused on our Virginia relatives in the northern neck area, and as a matter of fact, I had relatives who owned land 20 minutes down the road in Stafford County and Spotsylvania County. And we visited grave sites, we visited structures that are physically still standing. They're about to fall over or get eaten by the trees and vines and stuff, but on foundations from the original homes where the ancestors lived. We went down to Jamestown, we went down to Williamsburg, we looked around that whole area. So we spent a whole week doing that, taking pictures, then I come back and I put them in my data sheet. Genealogy road trip number 2, which was last year, we did southern Maryland, and we did southwest Virginia. We went to Wythe County, went to Scott County, and again we visited grave sites there, areas where our relatives live. In southern Maryland, and literally only an hour from where I live now, I made contact with an individual who had been referred to me from a lady when we visited a church that my great-great-great-grandfather was a member of that church. She referred me to another individual, and he took us to a place where there was a gravestone in a bird sanctuary in a kind of a wilderness under a bunch of bushes and trees that was just laying on the ground, that as a youngster he had seen and he remembered. He took us there. We uncovered, somebody had put a cover on it, we uncovered it, and there is the grave marker for one of my, I want to say great times four, great times five grandfathers from the 1700s. You can still read the verbiage off it and everything, and it's just laying on the ground. And it's like an hour from my house. So, you know, the initial thing was visit the church. The lady there said, oh yeah, I know somebody who knows about that. She referred me to that person. He was more than willing to take us out and show it. In fact, I've been in contact with him a couple of times since then. And so you just make these contacts. Go visit a genealogy society like ours here in Arlington or in Alexandria, or visit ones in different places. Write to them, seek information, seek a researcher to help you. Genealogy road trip number 3. I'm going off in 10 days. I'm going to Boston. I'm going to meet my sister there. We're going to see where all of our relatives lived up there in the Boston area. Then we're going to go up to Brattleboro, Vermont, where I had a relative who had the first store in Vermont up there. And then we're going to come down to Saybrook, Connecticut, and we're going to visit an area where some of my relatives were born, and then we're going to come home, and then I'm going to eventually send her home tired after the end of a week. I'm not sure where we're going to do, if we're going to do a genealogy trip number 4, because that would be Long Island, New Amsterdam. I know there's a house there that our relatives lived in the late 1600s, 1700s, still standing. I just don't know if I want to deal with the New York traffic and Long Island traffic to physically go see it. But that's just a week for my sister and I. I mean, I could not convince my wife to go on any of these because she's not into genealogy. And my kids are all, you know, gainfully employed, raising their families and working. But my sister and I we have a blast. We take pictures, we talk to people. I may end up coming back with more contacts to seek more information. Yesterday I was getting information pulled together for a trip, and I found a new relative I didn't even know existed, a great times 9 grandfather who founded the town of Lancaster, Massachusetts. He was one of the original founders. I didn't even know about him. He's buried in the cemetery at Lancaster that we are planning to visit. There's a huge memorial to him as a founder. I didn't know anything about that until yesterday. So that is definitely now a new thing we are going to see, take pictures of. Along with some other, we're going to go to Boston to the old burying ground and see the gravestone of a great times 11 grandfather who is buried there.
So have you done any DNA?
I have done DNA testing with Ancestry, and then I followed it up with the Y chromosome DNA testing of Family Tree, specifically to try and find a relative who is related to my Welch line from Ireland. I know the names of my great-grandparents Welch, who immigrated from Ireland. I know their first child was born in Boston, in Brighton, Massachusetts, actually. In fact, we're going to go visit the church where he was baptized on our road trip next week.
Wow.
I have not been able to find that relative via the Y testing DNA, but the Ancestry DNA, I've done that testing, and my sister did it about 2 years later. Her results popped up immediately. They said, this person is either a sibling or a parent. Lo and behold, it's my sister. Her daughter did it. When her results were included, it popped up and said, this person is a close relative. Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's my niece. Mm-hmm. Okay, mm-hmm. I mean, it's good that it showed that test, it showed that information. But yes, I have done the test, both of them. Their results from the 2 different testing organizations are fairly similar. They track with what I have found out in my genealogy research. I'm primarily English, but I got some Irish, I got some Scottish, I got some German, I have one Italian in there. It doesn't show up, and it doesn't show my Native American blood, but we probably won't get to it today, but in our next meeting, I'm pretty sure I'm related to Pocahontas, and I'm also related to a Princess Mary Kitamanquin on the other side of my family. One's on my father's side, one's on my mother's side, who was in southern Maryland in the mid-1600s and then moved to Virginia. I pretty much convinced myself that I am related to both, but that's so many generations back. They're great times 9, great times 10, great times 11. It's not going to show up in my DNA test.
I mean, ancestry, that can only, autosomal only goes maybe 7 generations or so, and because it divides each generation. So, but the Y, perhaps, although you're not going to get to Pocahontas through a Y.
Right.
And the other thing that's important about the DNA is to continue to look at it, because new people are submitting their results all the time, and Ancestry has grown, just in a year or two, has almost doubled. They're like at 12 million or so of people who have submitted their DNA. So just keep looking at that, because you may wind up.
I do, and one of these days I'm going to get that call from that person that says, I'm your relative, I live in Ireland, I know where your great-grandparents lived in County Cork, and hi, how are you?
I wish you luck on that. I think we would all like that. Europe is not quite as keen on this yet. We're still hoping that more people will do that.
Did find, or second cousin of mine did find a relative back in Scotland related to my great-grandmother that came over. Yeah. In fact, through that we were able to find the daughter of my grandfather's, one of his brothers that ran away from home as a teenager. So we're just about out of time. Do you want to do a plug for Mount Vernon?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Jeff,
do.
because this has been very interesting, and we appreciate you being here. And then I want to put a plug in for our genealogical society, Mount Vernon Genealogical Society here in Alexandria. We meet every month. We have an interesting speaker. We have a research center at Holland Hall in Alexandria on 1500 Shenandoah Road. And you are always welcome to come to hear the speakers, to talk to the other members, and advance your genealogical journey with us.
So thank you for coming, Jeff.
Thank you.